That truck belongs in a junkyard. The words came sharp and clean, slicing through the crisp morning air like a blade through silk, and the moment they landed, the entire executive team erupted into laughter, polished, practiced laughter, the kind that powerful people use to perform agreement. Victoria Sterling stood at the top of the limestone steps outside her headquarters, immaculate in a charcoal blazer and heels that cost more than most people's monthly rent, and she was pointing at a rust-covered pickup truck parked just beside the main entrance. The truck looked like something dragged from a demolition yard, paint peeling in long amber strips. The passenger door a slightly different shade than the rest of the body. One side mirror held on with electrical tape. It sat completely still, unbothered, as if it had been parked in that exact spot for decades and had every intention of remaining there forever. Its owner, a quiet, grease-stained single father named Ethan Carter, stood nearby and said absolutely nothing. He didn't flinch. He didn't look away. He simply watched Victoria Sterling with the calm, unreadable patience of a man who had already seen this scene play out 100 times before, and who already knew exactly how it ended. What nobody standing on those limestone steps understood was that Ethan wasn't embarrassed. He wasn't even mildly uncomfortable. He was waiting because within the next hour, Victoria Sterling would discover a truth so staggering, so quietly devastating, that it would silence every executive in that room and force her to confront something she had never once considered in 38 years of building a career on appearance, status, and the art of being seen. The rusty truck wasn't a symbol of a man who had failed. It wasn't the calling card of someone who didn't belong. It was, in every sense that actually mattered, the reason Ethan Carter secretly and completely owned every single building on the entire block where Victoria Sterling had spent years building her empire, and had done so without ever once announcing it to the world. The morning had started perfectly for Victoria. The city's most prestigious commercial district was alive, with the particular energy of a place that knows it is important. Delivery trucks, moving efficiently between towers of glass and steel, suited professionals walking in tight, purposeful clusters, the smell of expensive coffee drifting out of lobbies, where lobby art cost more than small houses. Victoria had ridden through all of it in the back of her black limousine, reviewing final documents for what her team was calling the deal of the decade, a multi-hundred-million-dollar expansion that would give Sterling Enterprises controlling ownership of the surrounding commercial properties and cement her company's dominance over the most coveted real estate corridor in the entire city. She had been in a genuinely good mood, the rare, deep kind of good mood that comes not from caffeine or compliments, but from the feeling that everything you have worked for is finally arriving exactly on schedule. Her chief of staff, a carefully groomed man named Daniel Whitmore, had confirmed that morning that all parties were aligned, all signatures were anticipated, and that the seller's legal representatives had confirmed full cooperation. Everything was set. Everything was perfect. Then the limousine pulled up to the entrance, and Victoria stepped out into the autumn light. And there it was, that truck. It sat directly adjacent to the main approach lane, parked where a vehicle like that had absolutely no business being parked, and it ruined the composition of the entire scene, the way a cracked tile ruins an otherwise flawless floor. Victoria stared at it for a full 3 seconds before saying anything. Her assistant Marcus, who had a finely tuned ability to read her moods, immediately pulled out his phone to call building security. Daniel Whitmore cleared his throat. 2 of the visiting investors, men who had flown in from overseas specifically for this occasion, glanced at each other with the small, knowing smiles of people who recognize theater when they see it. And then Victoria said it, loudly enough for the whole entrance to hear. "That truck belongs in a junkyard." The laughter came fast and warm. The security guard at the front door began moving toward the vehicle. It was, by every measure Victoria understood, a perfectly reasonable thing to say. And that was the problem she didn't yet know she had. Ethan Carter stepped out from around the side of the truck at that moment. Wiping his hands on a rag, he tucked into his back pocket with a practiced economy of motion. He was 42 years old, and he looked every year of it not in a defeated way, but in the way that men look when they have spent decades doing actual physical work and have never particularly worried about disguising that fact. His shirt was faded at the collar. His jeans were clean but worn. His boots were steel-toed and scuffed. He had dark hair threaded with gray at the temples, and a face that was pleasant and entirely unremarkable until you noticed his eyes, which were steady and dark and gave nothing away whatsoever. Victoria looked at him, looked through him, and then looked back at the truck with the expression of a person who has identified a problem and expects it to be solved by someone else. She nodded toward the security guard. The guard approached Ethan, and Ethan calmly, without a flicker of agitation, simply shook his head once and said, "That won't be necessary." The guard hesitated. Something in Ethan's tone stopped him, not aggression, not volume, just a quiet certainty that felt like a wall. Victoria watched this exchange with narrowing eyes. She was not accustomed to being not necessary. She crossed her arms and announced, in a voice she typically reserved for boardrooms, "People like you don't belong here." Ethan looked at her for the first time directly, and the faintest possible smile moved across his face. "I suppose we'll find out soon enough," he said. "Exactly who belongs here." The meetings were scheduled in 3 overlapping phases, beginning with a private briefing for the investor group, followed by a walking tour of the commercial properties, and culminating in the formal signing ceremony in the main conference room of Sterling Enterprises headquarters. Victoria led the first session herself. As she always did, she was extraordinary in these rooms, commanding without being aggressive, precise without being cold, able to translate complex real estate strategy into language that made wealthy people feel brilliant for agreeing with her. The investor group, 14 people in total, representing capital from 4 different countries, followed her from room to room in various states of admiration. She showed them architectural renderings, zoning maps, projected revenue models, tenant retention data. She spoke about the neighborhood's transformation over the past decade, with the fluency of someone who had not only studied it but shaped it. By the time the walking tour began, the investors were not merely interested, they were hungry. It was during the walking tour that Ethan Carter appeared again, and this time Victoria saw him before he saw her. He was standing near the entrance to one of the smaller commercial buildings on the block, a handsome brick structure that housed 3 tenants, 2 of which were local businesses that had been operating there for more than 15 years. He was speaking quietly with a man in a suit, and he had a folded set of papers in one hand that, from a distance, looked like legal documents. Victoria assumed he was a maintenance contractor, someone who had been called in to fix something, perhaps, or deliver supplies to one of the offices. She pointed him out to the investors. As an example, she did not say this exactly, but the implication was clear of the kind of informal, uncoordinated presence that her expansion plans would eventually reorganize into something more professional. "There are still some inefficiencies in how the surrounding properties operate," she said, gesturing broadly. "That's exactly what we're here to change." One of the investors, a heavy-set man from Northern Europe, named Mr. Brennan, looked at Ethan with casual curiosity and then looked back at Victoria. "What does a man like that earn in a year, do you suppose?" he asked. Not unkindly, but not carefully either. Ethan, who was closer than they realized, heard the question clearly. He turned, met Mr. Brennan's gaze with no particular emotion, and said simply, "Enough to sleep well at night." The investors laughed warmly, the way people laugh when they think they're laughing at someone, and Victoria smiled too, because she assumed the same thing they all assumed. But then something shifted. Ethan fell into step just behind the group, as they moved from building to building, and he began asking questions. Not the questions of a curious bystander, not the questions of a man trying to seem important. They were surgical, specific, methodical questions about easement rights and covenant structures, and the particular legal language used in one of the land transfer agreements Victoria had circulated earlier that morning. A real estate attorney on Victoria's team, a sharp woman named Claire Holt, who had been practicing property law for 20 years, stopped mid-stride when Ethan cited a specific clause in a municipal zoning ordinance that even she had needed to look up twice. She turned and looked at him with an expression that was not quite suspicion, but was in the neighborhood of it. Victoria, watching from 3 feet away, felt the first thin needle of something she couldn't immediately name. Not alarm exactly, more like the early warning sensation of a room being slightly too quiet. She shook it off. Ethan Carter, in his worn boots and faded shirt, did not fit any category of person who warranted her concern. She had built an entire career on reading rooms, reading people, reading situations, and she had never once been wrong about someone who looked like that. Then his phone rang. He glanced at the screen, took the call, listened for no more than 10 seconds, and said 5 words in a voice that was entirely calm and entirely final. "Don't sign anything. I'm coming." He hung up, looked at the time, and said to no one in particular, 20 minutes. Then he walked away without another word. And Victoria watched him go with the growing, unsettling awareness that she had no idea what he was talking about, but that somewhere, in a room she hadn't accounted for, something was happening that concerned her deal. To understand what was truly happening on that autumn morning, it is necessary to go back past the glass towers and the renovated storefronts, back past the years of development, money, and city planning committees, and the slow, deliberate gentrification of what had once been a half-forgotten industrial neighborhood on the western edge of the city, back to a time when this block was not a destination but a leftover, a collection of aging warehouse buildings, vacant lots, thick with weeds, a few stubborn businesses clinging to leases that nobody else wanted. Back to when Ethan Carter was not yet 30 years old and was driving through this neighborhood beside his father, in a truck that was, even then, beginning to show its age. His father's name was Robert Carter, and he was a man who had worked with his hands his entire life, first as a carpenter, then as a contractor, then as a small-time property manager who had learned the mechanics of real estate not from textbooks but from decades of fixing things that other landlords ignored. Robert was not educated in the formal sense. He had never attended college, never sat in a finance seminar, never read a real estate investment strategy guide. What he had instead was something harder to acquire and impossible to fake. The ability to look at a thing that everyone else had written off and see, with absolute clarity, what it would become. He had driven Ethan through this neighborhood on a Tuesday afternoon in late autumn, pointed at the crumbling facades and the weed-choked lots, and said, "This is it, son. This is the one." Ethan had been skeptical. The neighborhood looked, to anyone applying conventional logic, like a financial sinkhole. The banks agreed. Robert had approached 3 different lending institutions and been rejected with varying degrees of politeness. A neighbor had laughed openly when Robert mentioned his intentions. A former business associate had called it the worst idea I've ever heard from a man who should know better. None of it deterred Robert Carter by so much as a single step. They started small, the way all great things start, a single lot, purchased for a price that reflected everyone else's low opinion of it. Then a derelict warehouse that had been sitting vacant for 6 years, then a corner storefront that had changed hands 4 times in a decade, without ever finding stable footing. They negotiated carefully, paid in full when they could, structured payment plans when they couldn't, and they recorded everything in a series of handwritten ledgers that Robert kept in a fireproof box under his bed. Ethan, who had trained as a structural engineer and had an instinctive feel for load-bearing questions of all kinds, assessed each acquisition with methodical precision, checking foundations, evaluating structural integrity, calculating renovation costs against long-term rental potential. They reinvested everything. They lived without luxury. There were months when the finances were genuinely frightening, when a single unexpected repair could have destabilized everything they'd built. Robert would look at those numbers, look at Ethan, and say, "We're not done yet," and then he would make coffee and go back to work. Robert Carter died on a Sunday morning in early spring, in the same modest house where Ethan had grown up, with his ledgers on the nightstand and the truck keys on the kitchen hook where they had always hung. He left Ethan everything, not just the properties, not just the carefully maintained records, but the philosophy behind them, the patience, the willingness to be invisible in a world that rewarded spectacle. Ethan had sat in his father's kitchen for a long time after the funeral, reading through the ledgers, tracing his father's handwriting across decades of careful accumulation, and he had made a quiet, private decision. He would continue exactly as they had begun. No press releases, no profile interviews, no dramatic announcements, just work and time, and the kind of faith that doesn't require an audience. He kept the truck because it was the last physical object that remembered all the drives they had taken together through streets that nobody else believed in. He kept it because on its torn bench seat, beside its cracked dashboard, he had heard his father say things about value and patience and the long game that no business school on earth could have taught him. The truck was not a sign of poverty. It was the most important document he owned. The formal signing ceremony had been arranged in Sterling Enterprises' largest conference room, a sleek, high-ceilinged space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the very block that was the subject of the day's transaction. The room was filled with the controlled energy of a significant occasion. Legal teams arranged on opposite sides of a long table, assistants moving quietly along the periphery with documents and water glasses, the soft mechanical whir of a printer producing final copies of agreements that had taken months to negotiate. Victoria Sterling stood at the head of the room, feeling the particular pleasure of a moment that is arriving exactly as planned. The lead attorney for the selling party, a measured, silver-haired man named Richard Fowler, who Victoria had dealt with twice before and found thoroughly professional, was seated across from her counsel, arranging papers with unhurried deliberateness. Everything was exactly where it was supposed to be. The investors were seated along one side. The signing was minutes away. Then the conference room door opened, and Ethan Carter walked in. He was still in the same clothes. He had not changed, had not transformed, had not arrived as anything other than exactly what he had been all morning. A man in worn jeans and a faded work shirt who moved through rooms with the easy, unbothered confidence of someone who has never needed a costume to feel at home anywhere. Victoria's assistant made a motion to intercept him. Victoria herself raised one hand toward the security personnel near the door. She was not merely annoyed, she was affronted in the specific way that powerful people are affronted when the boundaries they rely on to maintain order fail to function. "Please," she said, with the icy precision of someone who does not say please and mean it, "remove this man from the room." Two security staff members began to move, and then Richard Fowler, the silver-haired attorney for the selling party, stood up from his chair, adjusted his jacket, and said with complete composure, "Good afternoon, Mr. Carter. We've been holding for you." The room did not merely go quiet. It went the kind of quiet that happens when the gravity of a place suddenly shifts and everyone feels it at once, in their bones, before their minds have finished processing what their ears just heard. Victoria's assistant froze. The security staff froze. Victoria herself stood at the head of the table, with her hand still slightly raised. And for one long, surreal moment, she could not make her body do anything at all. Ethan nodded to Fowler, pulled out a chair directly across from Victoria Sterling, and sat down. He set a leather portfolio on the table, plain, unbranded, worn at the corners, and folded his hands on top of it with the patient ease of a man who has been in many rooms like this and found all of them essentially the same. Victoria looked at her attorney. Her attorney looked at Fowler. Fowler opened his portfolio and slid a document across the table, not to Victoria's attorney, but to Victoria herself, and said in a tone that carried no drama whatsoever, because it didn't need any. "The party of record on all the properties under discussion today is Ethan James Carter. That includes the warehouse complex on the north end, the 4 commercial buildings along the main corridor, the surface parking holdings, and the 2 mixed-use properties currently under long-term lease. Mr. Carter has been the registered owner of all assets in this transaction for a period of between 7 and 19 years respectively." Victoria looked at the document. She looked at the name on it. She looked at Ethan. She said nothing. There was nothing to say. The silence that followed Richard Fowler's announcement was not the ordinary silence of a room waiting for someone to speak. It was the silence of a fundamental reordering, the kind of quiet that descends when the structure people have been standing on suddenly reveals itself to have been built on different ground than anyone assumed. The investors shifted in their seats. Legal assistants stopped pretending to be busy with their papers. Victoria Sterling's chief of staff, Daniel Whitmore, stared at the document in front of her with the fixed, slightly vacant expression of a man who is running calculations that keep producing impossible results. Victoria herself stood very still for what felt like a long time before she finally sat down in her chair, not with her usual controlled grace, but with the small, involuntary drop of someone whose legs have made a decision slightly ahead of the rest of her. She opened the document. She read it. She looked at the next page. And the next. Every line confirmed what Fowler had said. Every property she had been planning to acquire, the buildings she had pointed to during the walking tour, the lots she had referenced in her revenue projections, the parking structures her architects had already incorporated into the expansion renderings. All of it carried Ethan Carter's name. Not a shell company, not a trust with some corporate name designed to obscure its origin. Just his name, plain and direct, on document after document after document. She checked the dates. The earliest acquisition went back 19 years. 19 years of ownership, of quiet maintenance, of long-term leases and careful property management. All conducted entirely below the surface of any world she had ever paid attention to. Claire Holt, her real estate attorney, leaned close and murmured something about conducting additional verification, and Victoria nodded mechanically, but they both knew it was formality. The documents were airtight. The notarizations were in order. The chain of title was unbroken and crystal clear. Victoria looked across the table at Ethan Carter. He had not moved, had not produced a triumphant expression, had not done any of the things that a person in his position, having just comprehensively reversed the assumptions of every single person in the room, might have been expected to do. He was simply sitting there, hands still folded on his portfolio, watching her with those steady, unreadable dark eyes, and waiting. She cleared her throat. She was not accustomed to asking questions she didn't already know the answers to, but she forced herself. "Why?" she said, keeping her voice as level as she could. "Are you dressed like that?" Ethan looked at her for a moment, and the trace of that faint, earlier smile returned. "Why would I dress any differently?" he asked. The question was not confrontational. It was genuine, and somehow that made it worse because Victoria realized, sitting there with 19 years of his ownership history in her hands, that she had no answer. The investors exchanged glances. Two of the executives who had laughed that morning in front of the truck were now finding the table surface extremely interesting. Claire Holt made a small note on her legal pad that she immediately covered with her hand. Then Ethan opened his portfolio and began to speak, and for the next 40 minutes, the room was entirely his. He walked them through the history of the properties with the methodical precision of someone who had personally touched every brick and beam which, in many cases, he had. He described the structural renovations he had overseen, the tenant relationships he had cultivated, the zoning negotiations he had navigated, the long game that he and his father had played in a neighborhood that the rest of the city had largely ignored, until it suddenly, inevitably became valuable. He spoke without notes, without slides, without any of the presentation infrastructure that Victoria's team had spent weeks assembling for this occasion. He didn't need any of it, because he wasn't presenting information he had prepared. He was simply describing something he had lived. When he mentioned that the block had at one point been assessed at a combined value that was less than one of Victoria's current limousines, no one laughed. And when he noted, quietly and without particular emphasis, that he currently held title to approximately 83% of the commercially zoned property within a 3-block radius, the room absorbed the number in the stunned, recalibrating silence it deserved. Ethan Carter did not own some of this block. He owned nearly all of it, and he had owned it, quietly and completely, for nearly 2 decades. Victoria returned to her office on the afternoon of the signing meeting and sat at her desk for a long time, without touching the papers stacked in front of her. Her assistant knocked twice, and was told, very quietly, that she did not want to be disturbed. She sat in the particular stillness of a person who has been told something they cannot yet organize into a coherent response. And she thought not strategically, not tactically, but in the unguarded, undirected way that she almost never allowed herself to think. She thought about the way she had pointed at that truck. She thought about how naturally and easily the contempt had arrived, how completely automatic it had been, how warmly her team had echoed it back, as though she had said something perceptive rather than something reflexive. She thought about the laughter. She thought about Mr. Brennan, asking what a man like Ethan earned in a year, and she thought about the fact that she had smiled at the question. She had built her career, her reputation, her identity on the premise that she read people and situations with unusual accuracy, that this was, in fact, the core competency that separated her from the merely successful, and she had looked at Ethan Carter. This man who had been quietly building real and lasting value in this neighborhood since before her company had even identified the corridor as a target, and she had seen nothing. She had looked directly at him and seen the truck, the clothes, the grease stain on his cuff. And from those details, she had assembled a complete and wholly fictional portrait of a person who did not exist. The real person had been standing right in front of her the entire time, and she had been too fluent in the language of appearances to notice. She pulled a notepad toward her. She still preferred paper for the thoughts that mattered, and she wrote a single line at the top. Then she looked at it for a while. Then she turned the notepad face down and looked out the window at the block below. The block that was, she now understood, essentially Ethan Carter's, and had been for longer than some of her employees had been alive. She thought about her parents. They had been people of genuine achievement. Her father had built a regional manufacturing business from almost nothing. Her mother had run a law firm that still bore her name, and they had worked hard, and they had provided, and they had loved her in the functional, demonstrative way that people love when they believe love is best expressed through investment in appearances. The right schools, the right summer programs, the right first internship arranged through the right connection at the right firm. Everything had been curated toward an image of success that was supposed to feel, eventually, like success itself. And for a very long time, it had. She had never questioned the equation because she had never had cause to. She had performed and been rewarded, performed more and been rewarded more, and had eventually arrived at the top of the room she had always been pointed toward, and had found it exactly as satisfying as promised, which was to say, satisfying in the moment and immediately requiring replenishment. Standing at the head of her conference room that morning had felt like triumph. 2 hours later, sitting across from a man who had never needed to perform anything for anyone. She had felt something she was only now, in the quiet of her office, able to name hollow, not destroyed, not devastated, but hollow, as though she had finally pressed firmly enough against a wall she had always assumed was solid to discover that it was, after all, just a facade. Victoria asked about the truck on the second day. She had requested somewhat formally, through intermediaries, then eventually directly a follow-up meeting with Ethan, and he had agreed to meet her at a coffee shop 2 blocks from the headquarters, a small place that had been a tenant in one of his properties for 11 years. She arrived first, which was deliberate. She wanted, for once, to be the one waiting rather than the one who made others wait. She ordered coffee, sat by the window, and watched the street. When Ethan arrived, he came on foot, wearing essentially what he'd worn the day before. And he sat across from her with the same unhurried ease, ordered black coffee, and waited to see what she would say. "The truck," she said. "I need to understand the truck." She phrased it as a practical question, expecting a practical answer that it had classic value, or that he was simply unsentimental about vehicles, or that he kept it out of some form of studied eccentricity. She had already constructed several plausible explanations and had assigned rough probabilities to each of them. What she had not constructed, could not have constructed, was the actual answer. Ethan wrapped both hands around his coffee cup and was quiet for a moment, not thinking about whether to answer, she sensed, but thinking about how to say something that had never needed to be said out loud before. Then he told her about his father. Not the version of the story that would appear in a profile, not the compressed, marketable narrative of a visionary who saw value where others saw waste, but the actual story, with its texture and its difficulty and its long stretches of fear. He told her about the winter his father had negotiated the purchase of a building while they were both sleeping in the truck to save on accommodation costs during the due diligence period. He told her about the banks that had turned them away, the professionals who had condescended, the neighbors who had shaken their heads. He told her about the evenings they had driven through the empty streets of the neighborhood after everyone else had gone home, his father pointing at one dark building after another, not with the frustrated hunger of someone who wanted something he couldn't have, but with the calm confidence of someone who was watching something become what he always knew it would be. He told her about the morning he got the call, and about sitting in his father's kitchen afterward, with the ledgers on the table, and about the decision he had made in that kitchen that had governed every choice since. Victoria listened to all of it without speaking, which was something she rarely did. The coffee shop was quiet around them, a few people on laptops, the soft hiss of the espresso machine, the occasional sound of the street outside. By the time Ethan finished, she realized her coffee had gone cold. She also realized that something in her chest felt different from the way it had felt the day before, not just chastened, not just embarrassed, but actually different, as if a valve that had been stuck for a very long time had finally turned. She had grown up in a household where success was a performance, where what you wore and what you drove, and where you were seen and with whom were not peripheral matters but central ones, the vocabulary through which a person communicated their worth to the world. Her parents had not been cruel people, but they had been exhausting ones, perpetually engaged in the management of appearances, and Victoria had absorbed this as the natural order of things so completely that she had never once questioned it. She had simply optimized. She had become better at the performance than almost anyone she had ever encountered, and she had mistaken that excellence for wisdom. Sitting across from Ethan Carter in a coffee shop that existed on land he'd owned for 11 years, she understood, with a clarity that was almost physical, that she had been measuring the wrong things for a very long time. "The most expensive thing I've ever bought," Ethan said, after a pause, "wasn't any of those buildings." Victoria looked at him. "It was understanding that I didn't need to prove anything to anybody." She didn't say anything immediately. Then she said, "I owe you an apology." And Ethan, to his absolute credit, did not perform graciousness. He simply said, "I know, and I accept it." And that was that. The investors came back. Of course, they did. The economics of the situation had not changed, and if anything, Ethan's complete ownership of the corridor had made the potential transaction more valuable, not less. There were 2 days of revised negotiations, conducted at a more appropriate table with more appropriate assumptions on everyone's part, and at the end of those 2 days, Ethan Carter received an offer that would have represented, by any reasonable accounting, a transformational amount of money. It was the kind of number that ends certain conversations permanently. The number that means your children's children will not worry, and their children after them. His attorneys recommended acceptance. His accountants ran projections that demonstrated acceptance was clearly optimal. Several of the investors made personal appeals, the kind that mix flattery with genuine persuasion in carefully calibrated ratios. Everyone in the room with a financial interest in the outcome agreed. The right answer was yes. Ethan said no. He said it without drama, without lengthy explanation, without the kind of theatrical pause that would have suggested he had been tempted and was managing his temptation for an audience. He simply closed the revised offer folder, set it to one side, and said that he wasn't selling. The investors absorbed this in various ways: disbelief, frustration, the particular consternation of people who have decided that money is the answer to every question and cannot immediately formulate a response when someone declines to agree. One of them leaned forward and began explaining, slowly and with careful emphasis, the scale of what was being turned down, as though Ethan might not have understood the number. Another suggested that a counteroffer might be welcome, that perhaps the figure could be adjusted upward, that perhaps different terms around the operational handover could be structured. A third simply stared with the open bewilderment of a man watching someone refuse to stop falling before hitting the ground. Victoria, who was present but no longer at the head of the table, watched Ethan's face and found that she was not surprised. She had spent 3 days recalibrating her understanding of this man, and she was beginning to understand that his decisions were not made in response to offers or pressures or room dynamics. They were made according to something internal and settled, the way his father's decisions had been made, and they arrived with a finality that was not stubbornness but simply completion. What Ethan did explain, after the immediate reaction in the room had subsided, was what he intended to do with the block instead. He had been thinking about it for some time. In truth, he had been thinking about it since before his father died, since the two of them had sat in the truck on a cold evening and talked about what all of this was actually for. He proposed to retain ownership of the majority of the corridor and use it to create a structured support ecosystem for small businesses, affordable commercial leases for entrepreneurs who were in their first 5 years of operation, shared infrastructure, and professional services, mentorship connections with established operators, a physical environment designed specifically to give people with real ideas and limited capital the kind of foundation that would otherwise take them a decade to build on their own. He had already spoken with 3 of the long-term tenants, all of whom had expressed immediate enthusiasm. He had a preliminary framework drafted. He had thought about the legal structure, the operational model, the funding mechanism. He had, in short, done what Ethan Carter always did. Worked quietly, prepared thoroughly, and arrived at a decision that was both completely his own and genuinely in service of something larger than himself. Victoria, listening to the plan, felt the second major shift of that week move through her. She leaned forward. She asked a question. Then another. And before the meeting ended, she had proposed a partnership, not the partnership she had come to the table seeking 3 days earlier, not an acquisition or a control arrangement, or any of the frameworks she typically used when she wanted to align her interests with someone else's. A real one. Built on the actual dynamics of the situation, Ethan's ownership and vision, Victoria's operational infrastructure and institutional relationships, and a shared commitment to doing something with this block that neither of them could have done alone. Ethan looked at her for a long moment, the same evaluating, unhurried look he had used in every room all week. Then he said, "All right. Let's build something." The months that followed were nothing like the weeks that had preceded them. The Sterling Carter Community Business Initiative named, at Ethan's quiet insistence, with his father's philosophy in mind, rather than anyone's personal branding ambitions, moved through its planning phases with a speed that surprised even its architects. Victoria threw the full weight of Sterling Enterprises' operational capacity behind the project. Legal teams, architectural consultants, permit specialists, community liaison officers. Ethan brought something different: relationships, decades of them, built through the slow, reliable accumulation of actually being present in a neighborhood. Knowing the shop owners by name, knowing which buildings had which quirks, knowing which city officials had spent years working on problems in this corridor, and which ones were newer to it. The combination worked better than either party had independently predicted. By the time the first phase launched 12 refurbished commercial units at below-market rates, with a shared services center and a formal mentorship program, there was already a waiting list of prospective tenants 3 times longer than the available spaces. Victoria Sterling was not the same person who had stepped out of a limousine and pointed at a truck. The change was not sudden, was not accompanied by any single revelatory moment, was not the kind of transformation that can be neatly located in time. It was more like a gradual correction. The slow realignment of a compass that had been pointing at magnetic north when true north was somewhere else entirely. She began arriving at meetings differently, asking different questions, measuring outcomes by different metrics. She stopped wearing her authority as a costume. She became, incrementally and imperfectly and genuinely, more interested in what was actually true than in what could be made to appear true, which is an entirely different orientation and a significantly harder one to sustain. Her staff noticed. Her board noticed. In time, the industry noticed, though the industry was slow, as industries tend to be, and it took longer than the actual change deserved. Ethan, for his part, continued to be exactly who he had always been. He was at the development site most mornings before the work crews arrived, doing the same kind of early morning walk-through assessments he had been doing with his father since before he was old enough to fully understand what he was assessing. He answered emails from prospective tenants himself, in plain language, without the mediation of assistants or PR filters. He attended community meetings where the audience was sometimes difficult, and he stayed until the difficult questions had been addressed. And he drove home afterward in the truck, which continued to occupy its spot on the corner of the block with the same serene indifference to public opinion it had always maintained. 12 months after the morning when Victoria Sterling had pointed at the truck from the top of her limestone steps, the block looked almost entirely different and felt completely different in the way that places feel different when the people inside them believe they belong there. 23 small businesses had opened or relocated into the refurbished corridor, a mix of service providers, creative studios, food producers, tech startups, and specialty retailers, most of them run by people who had good ideas and real competence, but had spent years being unable to access the kind of commercial space their work required. Hundreds of jobs had been created, real ones with genuine economic weight. The adjacent neighborhoods were beginning to feel the secondary effects. Foot traffic increasing, the small ecosystem of coffee shops and lunch spots and evening businesses that clusters around a healthy commercial district beginning to establish itself. The block had become, in the quiet and accumulating way that real things develop, what Robert Carter had believed it would become almost 2 decades before anyone else could see it. The waiting list for tenancy in the program had grown long enough that Ethan and Victoria were already in preliminary discussions about expanding the model to 2 additional corridors on the city's eastern side neighborhoods that currently bore a striking resemblance to what this block looked like when Robert Carter had first pointed at it through a truck window and said, "This is the one." Victoria's own organization had changed in ways that went well beyond her relationship with Ethan or the specifics of the community initiative. She had restructured her leadership approach, moving away from the top-down certainty that had always been her default mode towards something more genuinely consultative, asking questions earlier, listening longer before forming conclusions, building in the kind of deliberate space for dissent that high-performing teams require, and that she had previously, without fully acknowledging it, suppressed by the sheer force of her own confidence. Some of the changes were uncomfortable. Some of them revealed that she had, over the years, made decisions with significant consequences based on assessments she had formed too quickly and defended too absolutely. She worked through those realizations the way Ethan had built his portfolio methodically, without announcing the process to anyone, one honest accounting at a time. On a morning in the second week of the new year, Victoria arrived at the development site early, an unusual thing for her, and she had done it deliberately, wanting to experience the block at the hour when it was still transitioning from nighttime stillness into the motion of the day. She wore a coat that was expensive but not dramatically so, and she carried her own coffee, and she stood for a while in front of one of the refurbished storefronts, watching the light change on the brick. The truck was there, as it always was, parked at its corner like a fixture of the landscape, which it had now become. She walked over to it. She had seen it dozens of times in the past year, had become entirely accustomed to its presence, but that morning she stood next to it for a moment and looked at it with the particular attention of someone who has finally learned to look at things properly. Ethan appeared from around the corner of the adjacent building, hands in his jacket pockets, and stopped when he saw her. He waited, because waiting was something he was constitutionally excellent at. Victoria turned from the truck. "I used to think," she said, "that it was the oldest, most run-down thing on this block." Ethan came and stood beside her, looking at the truck too, then at the street around them, the storefronts lit from inside, the first businesses opening their doors, the distant sound of a delivery, and someone calling a greeting from across the street. He said nothing. "I was wrong," Victoria continued. "It's the most valuable thing here." Ethan was quiet for another moment. Then, softly, "It's just a truck." He said it the way his father would have said it, not as a dismissal, but as a reminder. The value wasn't in the truck. The value was in what the truck represented. Every early morning and late evening and difficult negotiation and patient, uncelebrated year that had built the world they were both standing in. The truck was a monument to the understanding that the most significant things are often the ones that go unremarked upon, that genuine wealth is accumulated in silence, and that the people who are truly dangerous in the best possible sense, the sense of being impossible to beat in the long run, are usually the ones who feel no need to announce themselves. There is a version of this story that ends with a moral delivered cleanly, a lesson packaged for easy transport. But the actual lesson is messier and more durable than that. Because it was written in 19 years and 2 lives, and a truck that should have been in a junkyard and wasn't. What Robert Carter had known, what he had spent his life teaching his son, and what his son had never forgotten, was this: the world will always offer you the chance to be impressive. It will always be easier to perform worth than to build it. It will always reward the appearance of power more immediately and more visibly than the slow, unspectacular accumulation of real substance. And if you are patient enough, genuinely, profoundly, structurally patient, and if you are willing to be invisible while you work, and to let the work speak for itself on its own timeline rather than yours, and to drive the same truck you drove when you had nothing, because you understand that the truck was never the point, then one day you will sit across from the most powerful person in the room, and they will discover, too late to matter in the way they thought it would, that the room you are sitting in has your name on the deed. Not to make a point, not to win, simply because that is where the work, done quietly and without interruption for long enough, eventually leads. Victoria Sterling learned this at 38, in a conference room that sat on land she had not known existed as Ethan Carter's property. She learned it the hard way, which is the only way certain things can actually be learned. And she was grateful for it, in the way you can only be grateful for things that cost you something real, not money, not time, but the comfortable certainty that you have always known how the world works. That certainty, once surrendered, does not return. What replaces it is more demanding and more honest, and ultimately, far more useful. The willingness to look at a person standing in front of you and resist the immediate, automatic story your experience tries to write about them. The willingness to ask what you don't know, rather than confirm what you assume you do. The willingness to be wrong in the direction of seeing someone clearly, rather than right in the direction of seeing only their surface. Ethan Carter had always known it, had it in his blood, in his father's handwriting in a fireproof box, in the dents and rust of a truck that had driven through every empty street of a neighborhood that everyone else had given up on and seen, every time, exactly what it was going to become. He had never needed to announce any of it. The work had always been enough. The block was full now. The lights were on. The people were arriving, not just the business owners and their employees and their customers, but the people who simply wanted to be somewhere that felt alive and real and built with intention, somewhere that had been chosen not because it was already valuable, but because someone had believed, for long enough and against enough resistance, that it could be. That belief, held quietly in the cab of a truck through all the years and all the doubt, had turned out to be the most consequential investment of all. And at the corner, patient and present and indifferent to the opinion of anyone who didn't understand what it meant, the old truck waited as it always had, as it always would for the morning to begin.